Good afternoon, everyone. This event is part of the monthly Melbourne Conversation series run by the City of Melbourne. We'll be taking questions throughout the event via the chat function on YouTube. Alternatively, if you don't have a YouTube account, you can send your questions to conversations@melbourne.vic.gov.au. You can also subscribe to this Knowledge Melbourne channel to stay up to date with Melbourne Conversations events. Today, we'll be discussing post-war architecture in Melbourne. For those of you who aren't familiar with what that is, that's architecture built from 1945, the end of the Second World War onwards, associated with the modern movement. City of Melbourne, following the lead of a number of global cities, is currently proposing to protect 55 key buildings that represent some of the best of our city's post-war architecture. Matters of heritage, of course, are always subjective and very much the topic of conversation. And in the spirit of open dialogue, we'll disclose right at the beginning of this event that the views expressed by all of us on the panel are our own personal views and do not represent the views of the City of Melbourne specifically. The City of Melbourne respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land, the Bunurong and Wurundjeri peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and pays respect to their elders past, present and emerging. We are committed to our reconciliation journey because at its heart, reconciliation is about strengthening relationships between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples for the benefit of all Victorians, or closing the non-Indigenous gap, as we might like to call it. We also acknowledge the First Peoples of whichever lands you are joining us from digitally today. We need to consider that all buildings rest on the ground. If the ground isn't considered, then what good are the buildings? This is a quote from Doreen Garvey-Wandin, a senior Wurundjeri elder, and a quote that resonates much with me. In this spirit, we note the challenge faced by the Melbourne Conversations in achieving adequate diversity and traditional owner representation on the panel that you will note has a particular predominance of white professionals. This highlights a continued underrepresentation in our built environment and heritage practices of diverse voices. This is really critical given the core cultural focus of the heritage discipline. Madison Miller from Heritage Victoria always speaks of this idea of how we shift our notion of traditional heritage practice from plaque and protect to an idea of living cultural landscapes. In that vein, if this is a particular interest of anyone, we encourage you to get in contact with Melbourne Conversations. I can personally recommend, if you're interested in exploring this further, the City of Yarra's Urban Aboriginal Architectural Walking Trail, which is an excellent opportunity to explore sites of significance of activism that led to some of the first stages of recognition, the likes of Doug Nicholls and others within the Fitzroy community. So to introduce myself, I'm Andy Fergus. I'm an urban designer, planner and architect. I'm the head of urban design at Assemble Communities, a developer in Melbourne with a really strong focus on ethical development in the build to rent sector. As we introduce each of the key speakers today, we're going to introduce our favourite building from the list of 55. So some of us had some overlap, but we were able to all agree on our own 4 preferred across the speakers. So to introduce my own personal selection of the building, and this will come up shortly on your screens. I've selected the building Gilbert Court, designed by J.L.A. LaGuerche. This is a building that was built in 1954, only a short time after the end of the Second World War, and it was completed in 1956. The reason I've chosen this building is perhaps has many reasons. So first of all, it's incredibly striking for me for its ability to achieve this kind of tower-like quality, this soaring glass form at the corner, which is facilitated by something called a free facade, where the columns are inset and the glass can be all the way around the perimeter without the obstruction of structure. This was Melbourne's first curtain wall glass building, so the first building in all glass. But it adhered to the city's 40-metre height limit. So it's sort of dwarfed perhaps compared to its New York friends of the time by Melbourne's height control, which really ensured that it kept within that height. If you flick to the next image, you can see the building has a striking quality that comes from its transparency. The building has this fine kind of detailing of these horizontal elements known as transoms, which distort your reading of scale. So rather than reading each scale of each level, as you can see on the building for the right, these extra transoms help sort of create this sense of scalelessness. So the building might be taller than it actually is. But if you move to the next image, I'm also particularly drawn to this incredible legacy of small floor plate buildings in the city and what they contribute to the business ecosystem of Melbourne. We can't have 1,500 square metre premium grade office everywhere. We need all sorts of diverse business spaces to make a successful city. So this kind of awful real estate photo nonetheless shows you this incredible spatial quality of small professional suites that provide for businesses, professional services, medical facilities. These are critical to the function of the Hoddle Grid. So I'm really excited by this building being protected both for its architectural contribution, but also the role it has in the kind of business ecosystem of Melbourne. So the next speaker I'm going to introduce is Felicity Watson, an executive manager of advocacy at the National Trust of Australia Victorian chapter. Felicity's an actively involved in event programming and a vocal social media commentator on all things heritage. And Felicity will introduce her favourite building now.
Thanks, Andy. And I have to admit that I stole my favourite building from you. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about this building, which is the Lyceum Club on Ridgeway Place. Probably one of the more modest buildings included in the Hoddle Grid Heritage Review, but one that has a really important history. I'm really drawn to buildings that tell stories, and this building literally tells the story of the changing role of women in society in the 20th century. And in that way, I think it's a very rare building and a very important one. So this is the headquarters of a private women's club called the Lyceum Club. In Melbourne, that started in 1912 as a chapter of an international network of clubs for professional women. It started with just 150 members, but after World War I, as women became more active in professional life and the public realm, it increased rapidly until the late 1940s, when it had more than 1,200 members. So they had a range of kind of temporary premises across the city. But in 1956, they decided to purchase their own premises and build a room of their own. And I think that the location of this building is really interesting. It overlooks the back garden of the Melbourne Club, which is notoriously a male-only private club. So I think it has a very interesting symbolic relationship with that building. And an important aspect of this building is that it does overlook the garden. So this building was designed by Ellison Harvey, who was the first woman to be awarded with a diploma of architecture at the University of Melbourne. She was also the first female fellow of the Royal Victorian Institute of Architects, so a really significant female architect. Another really beautiful aspect of this building is an addition which was completed in 2018 by Kirsten Thompson Architects, which is that top level of the building that you can see there, which adds another layer of significance to this building. And this building really tells the story of not just Ellison Harvey, but a number of female architects and interior designers, artists who contributed to the layers of this building over time. So I think it's a really important building for Melbourne. It's one that hasn't been recognised up until now. And I think that the fact that we're recognising it as a significant heritage place says a lot about our changing attitudes to heritage conservation.
Thanks, Felicity. And if you ever get an opportunity to be invited to that upper level, that is a sight to behold. It's quite an extraordinary space. Our next speaker is Tim Leslie, who's a fellow of the Australian Institute of Architects and a registered architect in Victoria with over 20 years of experience in the profession, but also a critical advocate for design quality and understanding the various legacies of heritage architecture across Melbourne. Tim will now introduce his building.
Thanks, Andy, and good afternoon, everyone. So the building I've chosen when it turns up is actually, for me, a really interesting project. It's a project that's a continuation of a really important firm, Bates Smart McCutcheon, in terms of the, I guess, their investigation in terms of modernist design, post-war design, and Sir Osborne McCutcheon being a key player in that space. This building, I think, has incredible relationship to a building, ICI House, which is nationally listed. It was the first glass skyscraper in Australia. It broke that 40-metre height limit and transformed the city of Melbourne. And what I love about this building, it's an evolution of the ideas of that firm. So ICI House was 1958, completely glass curtain wall. This building's 61, 62, it's completed. And what you'll see is a complete change of the attitude of the architects. This is actually using a curtain wall that uses precast elements on the outside to give it texture and rhythm and tie into a context. Batesmart moved away from doing pure glass walls after some of the panels of ICI actually dropped off. It was nicknamed the deciduous building for a little time. And this was to do with a fault in the glass nickel sulfide inclusions. And so they moved to a different style. And what this building does on its exterior is it talks about the facade as a decorative skin, and it communicates that to you quite clearly. What you'll see is that the precast elements in terms of the vertical component don't actually touch one another. They break at the spandrel level, which is at the slab level of the floor plates. And they also don't touch each other in the horizontal manner across what's called the transom line. And why that's important is it's communicating to you that this is not a load-bearing facade. So it's a decorative element, even though it's using precast, and it kind of introduces a new wave of thinking about materiality on the exterior of the skin. But further to that, the reason I chose this building is because of its ground plane. And so I might just ask for the next slide. Now, this ground plane doesn't exist anymore, but for me, it's one of the most beautiful ideas of what modernism was talking about. This is for me personally, about the connection of light, nature, and art. And ICI still shows this clearly today, whilst this building's infilled with shop fronts and the lobbies completely, I guess, compromised. And what you see here is this beautiful soffit, almost like a James Turrell illuminated ceiling plane. It's right in the center of the Hoddle grid. So instead of being able to use landscape and move out of the site, what they've done is they've actually internalized the landscape. They're giving this back to the citizens of Melbourne. You can move around the corner. There's these plants. There's these connections to ideas of like, I guess, modernism of the Farnsworth House, with these ideas of these floating elements that slide out of the building, the fire stairs cascading down. It's an invitation into the building, and then art is integrated into that. I just think it's completely exquisite. And for me, the reason I've chosen this is that modernist buildings are often about how they hit the ground. They're an idea about society. And you can see this idea of integrating nature and what it is to be human. They're not inhuman. In fact, a lot of them are about connection back to place. Maybe the next slide as well, if I may. And you'll see that there's a pond with water. These motifs are used throughout these buildings. So to me, what I would like to see if this building was heritage listed was the encouragement to revisit its ground plane in the future, because I think it's so important in terms of how you understand the design intent about these just over and above their facades and their, you know, I guess, adaptable floor plates. They were very visionary, and I think this is just exquisite.
Thanks, Tim. And our final speaker is Hannah Louie, the Vice Chair of DocoMomo, with expertise in the documentation and conservation of modernism and co-editor of the award-winning book, Australian Modern, Australian Landscape and Design. I think Hannah is probably the one on the panel who can most claim to have the greatest length of engagement with modernism and the active promotion of its conservation in Melbourne. Hannah.
Great, thanks, Andy. I'm not sure if I can claim that, but thanks anyway. And thank you very much to the City of Melbourne for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. And the building I chose is the former National Bank Australasia Stock Exchange branch at 85 Queen Street. We probably need the next slide. That's it. Yep. And I picked this building a bit because I didn't really know anything about it until I looked at the study. And it's by the architects Meldrum and Partners. And it's kind of interesting, I think, when we put them in chronological order a bit, because this sort of follows on from the things I think that Tim was saying. So this is completed in 1973 and coincides with a kind of global oil crisis. It's obviously part of the banking sector, and therefore I think it sort of speaks to a lot of these buildings that we're looking at, which are really about making those global finance sectors visible in city centres, and that they're subject to quite rapid booms and busts, you know, across the 60s and 70s. It's architecturally interesting, I think. It's got sort of 13 bays. There's 10 or 11 floors, depending on how you count with the basement. And it shows this shift more away from the kind of sheer steel, glass, aluminium, lightweight curtain wall buildings of the 50s and 60s, a slightly more heavier, robust use of concrete panels, with some attempt to address climate, to provide a little bit of shading to the facade. And I think despite what might be characterised as buildings of this period in the city centre, which sometimes you can sort of see them as aliens in a way that disregard their location, and here the buildings this building takes its cue. You can't really see it in this slide, but if you go and have a look at it on Queen Street, it very much takes its cue from the sort of horizontal lines of the historic building facade next to it. So again, despite what people might say, often I think architects were quite skillful at looking at context. And you can see the detail here of these really nice, gently sort of curving precast concrete panel that sort of articulate each window, almost like a kind of more 1970s plug-in aesthetic, I think, or sort of mild-mannered brutalism. And so it speaks of here, but it's also tapping into quite a lot of shifts architecturally in the 1970s. And these are my own thoughts, not of the Hoddle Grid statement of significance, but there's a bit of a nod, I think, to buildings in the UK, like the Barbican Centre, that just starting to be completed. It was a very long build by Chamberlain, Powell and Bond. A bit towards Japan, perhaps, a sort of, again, that sort of plug-in metabolism kind of aesthetic, definitely to the USA and Canada. And just in my search around looking for buildings that look like this, I came across this great, it was an extension to the Camden City Hall in London, very contemporaneous early 70s building, and it's just been refurbished as a boutique hotel called the Standard Hotel. So I encourage you to have a look at a great example of what you can do with these buildings, I think. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Hannah. And I think what you can really see here, moving from the first building designed in 1954 through to this building built in the 1970s, is an extraordinary diversity of influences. And that's both influences internally within the industry in Australia, but also the influences of external architecture from these other countries that we've spoken about. So from here, we're going to move into our conversation. And I'm really interested in sort of the discussion of, what was it, soft brutalism as a sort of interesting or perhaps divisive term. Hannah, I'm interested in this conversation of where people might talk about why are we protecting these buildings, perhaps they're considered to be ugly or otherwise.
Sure. Yeah, look, I would like to pose the question to the panel and possibly to Felicity, because I know she's engaged an awful lot with this to do with kind of advocacy in the National Trust. But many people would say these buildings are ugly. They're all the same. They're far too recent to be considered heritage. And in particular, if we keep all this medium and high-rise post-war city centre buildings, are we sort of celebrating and conserving the very buildings that destroyed much of the earlier historical fabric of Melbourne? So throw it over to Felicity and others.
Thanks, Hannah. That's a really interesting question. And the comment that these buildings are ugly as a heritage advocate is one that I hear quite a lot. It's an argument that's often wheeled out by politicians or other people or decision makers who are sort of pushing against the idea of protecting modernist heritage and more recent eras of heritage. But by the same token, I talk to just as many people who are as incredibly passionate about this era of architecture as well, and that's definitely a community that's growing. I think it's important to remember that tastes and public opinion change over time, and that's certainly the case when we look at the history of conservation and the conservation movement in Australia. For example, in the modernist era, the buildings of the Victorian era were considered to be ugly and old. The Royal Exhibition building was considered to be a white elephant. It was derelict. It nearly was demolished. And the great modernist Robin Boyd called it obsolete in 1954, kind of epitomising that view of the time. But now it's valued as a place of world heritage significance. Its international significance has been recognised, and it's a really important part of our urban fabric today. So I think that, you know, while recognising those earlier eras of architecture, we're also now able to recognise the significance of those modernist buildings that carved their way through marvellous Melbourne. And taste as well is subjective. So the assessment of heritage places isn't just about looking at the aesthetic qualities of a building. There are a number of criteria that we use to assess heritage places, and we also compare these places against each other so we can find the best examples of specific types of architecture. So we look at architectural significance. Is it a fine or an innovative example of a particular style? Does it have historical significance, telling an important story about our history, like the Lyceum Club? Does it have social significance to a community? Does it demonstrate a high degree of technical achievement? And lots of the buildings that are identified in this study do demonstrate an extraordinary degree of technical achievement in terms of their innovative technology. And is it associated with an important person in our history? So, for example, a significant architect. So in terms of looking at the place of modernist architecture in Melbourne, which is a city which is renowned for its gold rush architecture and its marvellous Melbourne, to me, an interesting heritage streetscape is one that has layers of architectural styles and doesn't have that kind of that repetition in its fabric, that it tells a story about the evolution of that place over time. And a good example of that is Collins Street, the Paris end of Collins Street. Lots of conservationists would see that as a landscape of destruction, where lots of 19th century buildings were destroyed to make way for 20th century buildings and buildings of the modernist period. But I see it as the evolution of marvellous Melbourne and buildings in the Hoddle Grid Heritage Review, like Kurt Popper's 1970s apartment building at 13 to 15 Collins Street, the Reserve Bank building, Gilbert Court. All of these buildings together as a cultural landscape tell an incredibly rich story about our history. Hannah, I'm interested to know, from your perspective as an architectural historian, what's your take on that idea of ugliness?
Well, I think you summarised it well, Felicity, that there are issues of taste and they change rapidly, and we're already seeing that, you know, and even in the last decade of the reappraisal of 20th century architecture. So, yeah, ugliness and beauty are aesthetically sort of, you know, personal judgments.
Thanks, Hannah. If you've just joined us, my name's Andy Fergus and you're watching the Melbourne Conversations Post-War Architecture. We'll be taking questions throughout the event via the chat function on YouTube or via email at conversations@melbourne.vic.gov.au. Also remember, as we said at the beginning of the event, the views expressed by all of us on the panel are our own personal views and do not represent the views of the City of Melbourne. As an extension to Hannah and Felicity's conversation, I'm very interested in this idea of this sort of transfer of ideas, and we touched upon this a second ago in terms of influences out of the US. Tim mentioned the Farnsworth House, perhaps Lever House, another example in New York. This is perhaps a question again for Hannah. Sorry to bombard you, but can you perhaps talk about this transfer of international ideas and why that's so significant in the context of post-Second World War?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Yeah, I think, you know, a lot of the buildings that are mentioned in the Hoddle Street grid are significant on a number of dimensions in terms of these sort of exchange of ideas and influences. And that's not just design exchange. I think, you know, fundamentally they've got social and cultural significance. They're built at a time of internationalisation, of rapid fluctuations of kind of boom and bust, but Australian city centres are growing in confidence as kind of global centres of economic activity and flow, and therefore architecture starts to serve those needs and be symbolic of it. So it's part of a global, well, I think an Anglo-American Western Europe phenomenon at this time. And they also, I think they benefit out of a lot of technical knowledge that is exchanged around the world, great shifts in building construction techniques that we've already heard about, say in the evolution of curtain wall structures, which have been around a long time and come from America since the end of the 19th century, developed in places like Chicago and New York. So a curtain wall structure essentially is where the lightweight facade or skin kind of hangs off a solid core, if you like, or structure. And then we see huge advances in this after the time of sort of post-war material shortages and height limits. So after the early 1950s onwards, material advances around the world in glass, steel, aluminium, in prefabrication, how we build, and really importantly in concrete. And Australia's really up with the innovation in concrete particularly, for example, there's a new national code about concrete construction in 1958. So we get pretty good at precast concrete, but also design exchanges of ideas. So you see tall buildings on this trajectory from the late 19th century towards abstraction, I think, minimalism, a refinement of ideas around the grid and express structure. And that sort of move towards abstraction, you can see it in art, you can see it in a lot of aspects of culture. And Melbourne particularly, it's a grid city, and Chicago's a grid city, parts of Manhattan, I think there's some resonance there as well. So they're about abstract patterning, they're about transparency, reflectivity, and so on. So you could almost look at some of these buildings as a global set of things, I think, would be kind of interesting. And yeah, no doubt, lots of exchange of ideas from the early 20th century onwards in modernism, from Walter Gropius and the Bauhaus to Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, particularly when he goes to America. But the big American firms, as you know, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, and some of our own, like John Andrews, who works in America and Canada and then comes back to Australia. But it should be said that most of these Melbourne buildings we're looking at are the result of local architect practices, but they're very well versed in international trends through travel, through work experience, through partnerships with people like Skidmore, Owings and Merrill and so on, and through great shifts in the way education works in the post-war era. Universities, technical colleges make this radical break into teaching a modernist language.
I was just going to follow on with that as well. Like for me, this period is incredibly utopian. So the war was really like following like a depression, the Spanish flu, another depression. The quality of our built environment was across the board was, I guess, in some spaces not going terribly well. There was this idea after the war of great hope. Innovation through technology that was learnt through the war. Like a lot of the key designers were actually working as part of the war effort and learnt about flexibility. So what you find in office spaces, for instance, is the ability to have it open plan. Like it was a radical, and it happened in housing as well in terms of the open plan living, this whole transformation of how we connect with space and how we as people can inhabit buildings of all types. So they were aspirational ideas, and the spaces we take for granted now are actually really legacy to these ideas. And they were pregnant ideas for a long time, but they came to bear following the war. And initially, the first decade after the war, there was this material shortage, so you couldn't get the true expression of all of these things. But once you get past the mid-50s, we're into the serious boom. We then have a serious 10 to 20 years of incredible experimentation the ability to build, and some exquisite outcomes from this.
Thanks, Tim and Hannah. That's a really fantastic insight into setting the scene of the of architecture at that time. And I was lucky enough to work with you, Tim, this year on our World War II at Home project, which looked at that theme of modernism in the post-war period. And in particular, I was very taken by the essay that you wrote on ICI House, which is not included in the Hoddle Grid Heritage Review because it's already on the National Heritage List, but is a really interesting building to look at when exploring those ideas. But moving beyond the past, I'm interested to look towards the future. And as a heritage advocate, I'm very aware that we need to ensure that buildings can have a life in the future and that they're able to adapt to changing needs of people and of our society. And we've looked at two buildings which I think show different approaches to later additions to modernist buildings. On the one hand, we have the Lyceum Club, where we saw this beautiful addition by Kirsten Thompson that was really informed by the history of that building, by the aesthetic and architectural qualities of that building, and ended up winning a national award because it's such a great addition to that building. But then we have the other example where the fantastic foyer of the building has really been destroyed, and a sort of later addition has been put in its place, which has in some ways diluted the values of that building and the ability to understand its original intent. But obviously one of the roles of conservation and heritage protection is the ability to reinstate those values and to reinterpret what the original form of those buildings is. So I think we've seen a range of approaches to changes at modernist heritage buildings. But what do you see as the future of some of these modernist buildings and the role of heritage protection in that? I'm especially interested to hear from you, Andy, as an urban designer, about your view on that.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question on a number of fronts. I think perhaps a personal view of mine of the role of regulation is that it compensates for an absence of a culture. I think we use regulation as a way to perhaps enforce a spirit or an intent that is not yet universally agreed, or perhaps is in tension with commercial interests, which are obviously increasingly large and abstracted from place when we talk about global financial interests. But I think this idea of sort of how do we enforce a spirit of what might have been the intent, and I think Tim spoke eloquently about this idea of the spirit or the intent of landscape art, and this kind of arrival to the building is an incredibly sort of delightful thing. So I think Tim's example is such an interesting one to think about. You know, obviously the condition of the ground floor of that building is now pretty atrocious, but in moving forward, I certainly would think that Tim and all of us wouldn't expect it would be about reinstating that. It would be about, you know, if I was to brief a fantastic architect, what would be the best outcome that engages with that spirit in a new way? So how do we move forward, perhaps in taking some of the spirit of this era into a contemporary space that provides for the city's needs? We've got to keep in mind that when these buildings were being built, the city had hollowed out. We'd had the mass auto exodus of the city to the suburbs. We had the advent of the project home and people beginning to move to the outer edge of the city. The central city stopped functioning to the tail end of this period in the way that it did prior to this period, when it was a place to live and work. So we're talking about an era which was very much about a place of employment, a place of civic function rather than a place to live. So I think it's sort of interesting to think about that and how these buildings perform in the city that we have now. So in this context, it's really difficult to find a sort of language. And I guess something we were talking about as a group in the lead up to this conversation is, there's the tactics that architects or designers or planners might have to engage with these buildings are very different to building with a Baroque, Georgian or Regency or Victorian or Edwardian building, where the typical approach as espoused by the Borough Charter and other regulations has been clear visual distinction, read the new from the old, and often the use of a kind of neutral backdrop. So you often see these kind of glass buildings behind, if you think of the older fleet buildings, for example, or any of these sorts of examples, we see this kind of neutral backdrop. Now, these modernist buildings already are beautifully exquisite neutral backdrops in some sense and have detailing that we could never hope to achieve with current construction restrictions and requirements around thermal performance, etc. So what are the tactics we now have as designers to engage with these buildings? Is it about distinction, or is it about engaging with them on their own terms and finding a series of approaches that might be more appropriate to work with them? And that might differ across this era, from the curtain wall building in glass in the early periods through to the more perhaps Japanese metabolist inspired buildings of the 70s. But I think the key challenge with these buildings now is really around their thermal performance in the city. So in a changing climate, how can we provide comfortable contemporary workspace within these buildings that were designed for a very different time and were very reliant on air conditioning? So maybe Tim can sort of take that one further, having worked on some of these buildings.
Thanks, Andy. I was actually just thinking that in the interests of time, I would like to proffer probably a slightly more provocative, I guess, component to this, because I think you and Felicity have really covered this beautifully in terms of this idea. But and my provocative question is that whilst I'm obviously a massive supporter of this period of architecture, when I look at the Hoddle Grid, and when I think about the Hoddle Grid and what it means in terms of the economy of the state and indeed for Australia, and what these buildings were doing, and indeed that they demolished previous heritage, is the idea of future heritage. And what I'm, I guess, concerned about, or what I'd like the legacy of allowing for future architects, ones that aren't even born or ones that are just going through university now, to be able to have the opportunity to build architecture that we haven't even conceived of yet within the Hoddle Grid, to produce buildings which react to things that we're not quite, what is a post-COVID building, for instance, or whatever that might be in terms of how it manifests itself. And I guess with best intentions, it's like, how do we, this is a constant tension that happens in the heritage sphere, but just to make sure that there isn't so much control now with a range of different settings, C270 and other types of planning controls in combination with this, that there's an unintentional outcome that we can't actually build the next generation of architecture. So that's my provocative question. Back to the panel.
I'll jump in with a bit of a extra comment, and I agree with you, Tim, and I mean, sometimes I think, and again, this is my view and not anyone else's, that heritage protection can be a bit of a Trojan horse for kind of lack of good design, kind of a good design discourse, I guess, where architects can deal with what we've been talking about, the essence of architecture, but move it on. And it's really, that's about good architecture. And sometimes that might be about reinstatement of some of the things that people stuffed up, and we've seen it in some of the examples. And in the building that I looked at in Queen Street, I think that the raised up pilotis and foyer worked much better before they filled it in with glass. And if you want to make that building better, part of it might be taking it back, but kind of not doing that because it's about heritage regulation. It has to be done, and as Andy says, it has to be done in a sustainable way, because we can't deny that a lot of these buildings were built on a completely different model of energy consumption. They are about oil consumption and air conditioning. And so we can't treat them in the way that we treated, I think, older buildings. And I totally agree with the idea that we don't necessarily, I don't think the Borough Charter necessarily serves us well for this kind of architecture, where you have to articulate difference between the existing building and a new addition for all the reasons that everyone's already said.
I think it's an important point about the role of heritage protection to enforce the conversation. Without the heritage protection in place, a conversation can't take place, which I think maybe Felicity, if you were to extend on that.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I also agree that there needs to be a really robust discussion about the role of heritage protection and heritage conservation in these buildings. And my view is that we should be looking at each building on an individual basis based on an understanding of its significance. And that's really best practice in heritage. And you know, I think there is a need to develop, you know, a set of tactics and responses that we can use in relation to these buildings, but we also need to look at them individually. I think that having that trigger in the planning scheme through heritage protection provides a really important opportunity to ensure that the values of that place are considered in their future management. But the intention is not to lock that place at a point in time. We don't want these buildings to be static. We want them to be able to change and adapt, but with an understanding of what is significant about them and how we can create new layers of significance into the future. And then there's also the consideration of environmental sustainability from the point of view that it is better for the environment for us to adapt our existing buildings than to demolish them and to build new buildings. So I think there's a bit of a culture in our society where new is better, and you know, we want to be working from a clean slate and to be able to develop new things and put forward new ideas. But I think that in terms of sustainability, adaptive reuse is a really important tactic that we have to address climate change.
Maybe just to go back to perhaps what Tim was insinuating around allowing space in the city. I think the Hoddle Grid is such an unusual piece of city in the sense that it's a place of immense historic significance, both pre-contact and post-settler colonialism. But essentially, what's really interesting about it is that it coexists with the growth as the main marketplace of the metropolis at the same time as it's a place of heritage. So if we take Vienna or we take Paris, for example, we have the kind of La Défense model where you build the new business district, or in Tokyo, you've got Marunouchi, you build the new business district outside of the heritage place and you build all your new stuff there. But in this other part of the city, you sort of protect all the heritage. We don't have that condition, and we have a richer city for it, I would argue. This coexistence of buildings from every different era since settlement of this place. So I think it's interesting to continue to think of the city as a sort of collection of different eras, and you know, in the same way that perhaps an archive collection might think of what are the best examples from each era that we should carry forward, and this editing process of leaving behind those sites that we identify as strategic sites that could handle development. And I think we need to have this view both of regulation in terms of protecting these critical items, but we also need to make sure that we leave enough space in the city for these new buildings, these new generations of stories to be written. Did we have time for one more thought on that one? The future heritage?
The other thing I just wanted to say about that is that's where the importance of rigor in actually assessing these places comes in. And certainly the Hoddle Grid Heritage Review has been a very long process. I've been involved in it as an external stakeholder for several years, and it's been a really long process of really diving deep into the history of the city, to looking at what those significant places are and choosing the best of those places. So I think that it's really important, obviously protecting a piece of property is a very kind of restrictive thing to do in many ways. So it's really important to get it right. And so that idea of rigor is really important. And I think that that is something that the City of Melbourne is achieving with this study.
I can just jump in.
Thanks, Lucy.
As well, just a brief thought about and I totally agree with the need for all architects to be able to kind of reuse buildings as part of their future practice. But I was just rereading this book recently called Maintenance, and it's really interesting because it starts to talk about how we've sort of forgotten that maintenance is part of architecture, and these sort of buildings particularly had sort of quite particular forms of maintenance. How do you clean all that glass and sort of, and we expect modernist buildings to always look pretty sharp and pretty new. And in a way, I think also heritage is sometimes wheeled in as a bit of a fix-it for how do we maintain this and upgrade things and make them last well into the future. So anyway, there wasn't really an answer, but I was just sort of thinking about this idea about maintenance and thinking, yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it plays into a number of the questions. So we might start to make a move over to the audience questions. There's quite a few coming through there. So thanks for engaging. And maybe you can pepper us on social media later if you have any other questions. So maybe just to keep on the theme, there was Jane Toner had a question about these buildings were constructed at a time where we thought energy availability was boundless. How do we reconcile their relatively poor energy efficiency performance with their heritage aspects? And I feel that perhaps Tim would be a good one to answer that.
I think the answer is it's actually remarkably tricky in some cases. And so just because the building skins are there, and there is a lot of, with new building codes and changes and, you know, some of the things that we've seen in recent past, adaptive reuse can be challenging to building owners, and it's just to recognise that it's not just that because the building skin's there, you can actually upgrade it very easily. These facades are actually often single glazed, they don't have the best thermal performance and so on. So there is mechanisms to do this, there absolutely is. And that's been proven with a range of things that some architects have done in terms of this. But it's just to understand that it's not straightforward and it is costly, and that in some cases what you'll find is because these buildings were built really at a time of incredible efficiency, so we moved from redundant structure to very, very calculated structural solutions. They were, some of them did bounce around in terms of their floor plates. They were really tightly designed for the time. And when you look at current building regulations, the ability to adapt and the different needs for different uses, sometimes you find that the building slabs don't hold up, or the mechanical system needs to be completely stripped out, or the facade actually has got concrete cancer over time and you need to actually rebuild it, and you can't actually replace, you can't just refurbish it, you need to actually. So there is a lot of layers of complexity to this. It's not just as simple as saying you can just reuse the building as it is. Having said that, there's exquisite examples of where you do this successfully and you get the benefit of the original cultural piece in addition to how it's being reused. So, it's just recognizing that it's complex and not necessarily cheap, and that indeed some of these buildings in terms of a sustainable perspective actually leak like a sieve. And so they're, over the next 50 years, let's say they survive, if they've just got single glazing and they don't have the right mechanical systems and so on inserted into them, there's a problem in terms of their the actual performance in that sense. So it's complex, would be my response.
There's an incredible fineness and optimization that comes from these buildings too, which makes it hard to hide things behind an impossibly thin roof or glazing system. A sort of Federation or Victorian building is much more forgiving in what you can hide within a floor. Hannah, you were going to say something.
I know, just to jump in on what Tim's saying, great examples, and if anyone wants to follow it up, the organisation that I've been involved with, Docomomo, that's kind of been an obsession of a lot of people, and a lot of my conservation architects, and we have a conference every 2 years around the world, and there's a lot of sessions about retrofitting these kinds of buildings, and some great success stories, particularly from American architects at the moment, who are doing a lot in how you deal with skins and glass and so on. So yeah, there's some great knowledge.
Perhaps as an extension of that, there's a comment from Ania Zemechnich, who said Federation and Victorian buildings were built with pride to last. I'll note that that's an opinion. How long do you expect the current architecture to stand? And perhaps we can frame that question in the context of the current architecture as what we're talking about of post-war modernism.
Modernism in general has got a real problem, materials not lasting. Sometimes that's intentional because they're experimenting with, you know, all sorts of new materials, tensile structures, and we have to be prepared to renovate in a different way than you do with a masonry building. So the Maya Music Bowl or whatever needs, you know, it's like it needs a lot of care. And I think some of this again, experimental with plastics and panels and things lose their colour, and we do have to be pretty rethinking materials and adapting them, and that is good conservation, to put in materials that will last but that carry the spirit of the work of architecture into the future.
Perhaps in the residential context, the bitumen roof, Hannah, has been a particular challenge with water and other elements.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Tim said, that you know, things leak like a sieve in many ways, and that needs to be fixed. You know, but Victorian buildings leak too.
Yeah, I think the comment about pride is an interesting one, because I think these, as sort of some of these images of the building's initial intent show, that there was immense pride and optimism in the erection of these buildings. In terms of their ability to last, it was simply a matter of using materials that weren't yet proven. So there was no intent to build a building that wouldn't last. There was just no knowledge of how it might survive. One of my favourite sort of pin cushions to pick on is the Kensington Banks development in Melbourne's inner west, where there was a you know, extraordinary optimism about the use of rendered finishes and the like. And I think, you know, to the frustration of the residents who live there, we see again buildings built in the mid-90s that are causing significant costs for sort of remediation as a result of these materials. It's not necessarily an intent to build cheaply and short, it's the effects of experimentation with new materials, which you'll find right the way through the history of architecture. Maybe to jump from the physical to the cultural, there's a question here, I don't have a name to it, but the 50s is a time of huge European migration. How did this emerging multiculturalism impact on architecture in Melbourne? Or was it too white Australia then? Maybe Felicity.
I'm actually going to throw to Hannah on this, because Hannah, your depth of knowledge is probably a lot greater than mine. But actually, I mentioned the Kurt Popper building when I was talking about Collins Street, and he was a Viennese architect that migrated to Australia, like lots of emigre architects of that period. And that's a building that I've actually come to appreciate more as a result of this heritage review. It was one that I used to walk past almost every day, but didn't really know anything about. And so through the process of reading about the buildings in this review, I did learn about Kurt Popper and his architectural legacy. And so he stands out to me as one of the emigre architects who's been recognised as part of the Hoddle Grid Heritage Review. But Hannah, are you able to talk about that more broadly?
Yeah, a little. I think though that, yeah, there was a big influx and an influence of emigres, but in general, certainly starting out, they're more building in a domestic scale and domestic sphere at that time, and the sort of client networks and so on are more visible within housing and within medium density housing. I don't know off the top of my head how many of these emigrate in the larger firms at this time. It will certainly start to change, but you would also have some pretty, I guess, white, or what I would, you know, call, it's like, you know, what's the famous Brack painting with the grey overcoats and hats in Melbourne in the 50s? It's sort of more like grey Australia, maybe we could say. But
Collins Street 5 p.m.
Yeah, that's Collins Street 5 p.m. And there's a network of patronage, which would take some time for, I think, to break into. However, within there, I think there's a whole other story about their influence. Yeah.
Maybe if I can add to that as well, I mean, some of the work that's been done in recent years, it's uncovered the extraordinary legacy of the Jewish community in Melbourne in this period. And obviously with the events leading up to and during the Second World War, there's mass migration. But for a proportionally small community in the Melbourne context, they had an extraordinary impact on the sort of architecture that was built across Melbourne. I've actually got a fantastic map just somewhere over there, which shows the incredible output around places like Caulfield and Balaclava and other parts of Melbourne, and particularly the association of the Jewish community with flat building. So the sort of walk-up flat and these extraordinary sort of new ways of living in more urban way that were very much imports from the European context. But you're absolutely right in terms of the whiteness. We're still talking about Europeans that were admitted under the White Australia policy, or other sort of awfully named things like the beautiful bolts, where we, invited people of appropriate caliber to come to the country. So it wasn't for another, 15 or 20 years ago that we started to see a sort of shift in influence in the profession. And as we discussed at the start, we're still struggling with this this challenge of a lack of diversity within the built environment profession. Perhaps as a last question, just getting close to time, maybe this is a slightly more broader one than just modernism, but Katia Egan has asked, what are the best examples of buildings or precincts in Melbourne that balance very well the heritage and the modern? And I think in that context, that is, the modern is used in the sense of contemporary. So just to clarify, when we're using modern today, we're very much talking about this post-World War period. When I'm using contemporary, I mean buildings of now. So I'm going to take that question as meaning now. So what are the best examples of buildings or precincts in Melbourne that balance very well the heritage and the contemporary?
I might have a crack at it. So it's in a slightly different way. When I walk the city, what I find is intersections are really interesting. So rather than necessarily, I think as we spoke about, there's been a lot of renewal across the city, and sure, there's some precincts, but what I quite like is some of the intersections, and the intersections talking about different things. So the one I just spoke about before, which was really Burke and Queen, which has got two Bates Smart buildings at very similar times from a modernist, they're like a little mini gateway. But if you go to the block across, which is Collins Street and Queen, which is a different period completely, you've got the banking sector corner. So you've got these beautiful Victorian buildings. One's been removed, but originally it was a quadrant, amazing space. And you've got to another part of the city, you go up to the church component where you've got, basically St. Michael's next to Scott's. Again, built very similar, but a very different stylistic approaches. So I think our intersections, and actually when you have pairs, you've also got another one with 140 William as well. And then across the road, you've got the SOM, St. James's Square, St. James site. But these sites, I think, are where I find it really invigorating, where you've got this duality going on.
Hannah or Felicity, did you have any thoughts? Maybe one favourite?
Well, I'm all about that top end of Collins Street and moving into East Melbourne. I just think it's the most incredible cultural landscape. If you going further north, starting from ICI House and then moving past the back of Parliament House, where there's that fantastic new addition, St. Patrick's Cathedral with the fantastic Young Freeman offices that sit really beautifully next to that, past Tasman Terrace, which is my office and really my Melbourne HQ, but then down past the government office buildings, which I love, those modernist buildings, which really complement the old Treasury building, and then down the top end of Collins Street. I just, like Tim, I find that very invigorating and inspiring when I'm wanting to reconnect with the city and with its history.
And Hannah, did you want to finish with that one?
Well, I guess if you don't know ICI House, then you should look at it as a exemplar of a building of this period, but that's also engages with landscape and with art, and has been is still in sort of vital use today. So yeah, 1955 to 58 by Bates McCutcheon, and we've got some beautiful photos of it in Australian Modern in the book. You can have a look and go and see the building.
Might add my own 2 cents there. I could rattle off a list of 50, but I'm going to pick on Brookfield Place in Perth and Urban Workshop in Melbourne as two fascinating examples of where a whole urban block with a range of highly significant heritage buildings have been able to coexist with fairly modern new towers. So in terms of what Tim was talking about before, it's able to do both. So you get some level of demolition and removal of buildings that are less significant, coexisting with not just facades, not a lobotomy, but a full volume of the original heritage building coexisting with these new and old. I find those incredibly exciting precincts to sort of be up against the grit and material of an older building, but then have this sort of benefit and function and density of a sort of more contemporary building. So we might wrap up there. So thank you so much for joining the group of us. Don't forget to subscribe to the Knowledge Melbourne channel to stay up to date with the Melbourne Conversation events. We hold these Melbourne Conversation events monthly on a range of different topics. This is an unusual one focusing on heritage and architecture. There will also be a link in the chat to a survey following this event if you'd be happy to fill that out. And the City of Melbourne team would love to hear your thoughts on this event as well. So thank you so much for joining us.